your archaic infrastructure is probably much easier to get to.
Yeah.
So who's the other one? Me, that's I'm not.
Oh, yeah.
What's everything now? Dawson, boys.
I work for a company called Pegasus. I mean, it's business process software that we provide. Got a very large company of stuff. So I'm the one who finds all the code vulnerabilities. And that's they're saying all is not much of an exaggeration. When we're doing it, it's like 90% or more. I don't actually have but I can
Actually, it is security research. That's not how you do I don't know. I mean, like, it's actually security and government.
Yeah, that's.
I think we're doing the right things also.
you know what? As much as I
Your job is like closing. Yeah.
you know, it's maybe
Like, so I just pop over the snap.
they're honest. They're like,
We have basically different things. And I think that everybody agrees, like, we're fine with that. Definitely, I think we're going to be able to in the future. Probably figure out I don't know what price we're going to do. This we definitely do. Yeah. Oh yeah. That's what we do and I do anything.
what's an upgrade you've been doing that
It's working good though. I have to wear two. Well, I have to wear two hats. One is like the big line top of it. And there's something one guy and I'm like, okay. Like I do audits of like third grade. We don't have to be afraid of it. I don't care which vendor you use. You have to use the guy who I actually, yeah,
I'm now here for you. All right. The question is, what room is this broadcasting into? All right, we got the channel problem sorted out. Excellent. All right, so my name is Alan Friedman. I'm from the government, and I'm here trying to help. And hopefully today you will tell me how we can work better. So just a very bit of brief introduction. I've been a Fed for about 4 or 5 months. Originally, I did computer science. I did computer security and crypto. I wasn't very good at it. And so I went to grad school in a field public policy, which means I did a lot of economics, but not at like a professional economist level. And I did political science and organizational behavior, but not in any way that I could make a career in it. And so when you're mediocre in that many fields, you sort of end up in Washington, D.C. So I bounced around various research organizations before joining the U.S. Department of Commerce. So the basic gist that I'm going to be pitching you today, and I think it's been teased a little bit by some wonderful people here today, is that we're going to be having an open and consensus-driven multi-stakeholder process, and we'd like your help. Hey, look, some bullets. What are we trying to do? We want to foster trust, reduce friction, increase predictability, diminish calls for regulation, keep the man off your back, and of course, improve productivity. So I work for the U.S. Department of Commerce, or as we like to call ourselves, the good guys. Of course, we all get along in the federal government, but I don't have a badge, I don't have a gun, they didn't give me any of the cool toys, but, and we're not a regulatory agency, with a few exceptions that we can raise a little bit later if you guys are curious. What we do have is a focus on trying to make things work. And in particular, we're focused on the digital economy. We like the digital economy. It's a great buzzword. And more importantly, we think that it is one of these things that's going to drive growth and innovation and jobs and all those wonderful, happy things. And one of the other DC buzzwords we like to use is the ecosystem. But I actually really like this concept of an ecosystem. Because if you go back to biology, what do you learn about an ecosystem? Well, you can zoom in or out practically an unlimited amount. And that's very useful. You can analyze it the micro view or the macro view. You have competitors, you have collaborators. Sometimes you have different parts that do both at different levels. And often you have two things that appear unrelated until one of them gets way too big or goes away. And then you realize, oh, they're kind of interconnected. And that's part of what we're trying to do. So, you know, the ecosystem is a very powerful metaphor, but at the end of the day, commerce, we like markets. And we're for them. And we try to help them because, unfortunately, sometimes markets fail. So, in the security space, there are lots of people who have been talking about market failures. In fact, that's sort of my origin as an academic to think about this. But we're going to talk about policy today. So what's the policy context for thinking about how to address market failures in security? Well, we have our friends in Congress. And they do mean well, and sometimes they can work, but it takes a really long time. Legislation, even the best of days where you can get Congress to work well, actually takes a really long time to debate things. Takes a long time to get things done, and it's a very broad, crude instrument. It's very hard to write legislation that can actually grasp the nuances of very complex, subtle issues. So, what do? Well, you have legislation, and you also have our friend regulation. Or, as some people like to call it, job-killing regulation. One word. The challenge there is even when you think regulation is a good idea and necessary, it still takes a long time. It's hard to get right. And often whoever just yells the loudest gets to sway the debate. So what's left? If we can't have legislation, we don't want regulation because it takes too long and too clumsy a process, well, you know, we've got talking. We've got basically trying to say, how do we get all these perspectives? So, my boss, the assistant secretary, part of his agenda is something you guys might have heard of, which is managing the IANA transition and really fostering support for the multi-stakeholder model. What does multi-stakeholder mean? Well, basically it just means talking, making sure that we can hear different perspectives and finding ways to use conversation to end up in a productive environment where we can find common ground and move forward. He likes this idea so much that he said, listen, this should be used not just for international internet governance, but this can be something that we can actually use for domestic policy as well. We'll return to the idea of domestic later if you want. So we've been doing this for a while before I joined the Department of Commerce to identify issues where bringing different people together, the stakeholders, and saying, hey, how can we address these issues and make things work better, could actually make a difference. One of the things we've been working on is DMCA takedown notices. My colleagues brought together online publishers, web publishers, and content owners. Two groups that don't really like each other. In fact, they don't get along at all. But they're both bound by law, a very popular law in this room called DMCA. Now, they had never been in the same room before. And one of the things that we did is said, listen, we know you guys disagree about each other's business models, but the law forces you to work together. So let's find a way to at least standardize the interactions that you have underneath the DMCA law. How can we standardize and make more rigorous the takedown notice policy? And they did. They found a way of basically formalizing that, so at least behind the scenes, they had a better way of responding to each other and not having everything be, ad hoc, one-off. It was more efficient. We have an ongoing process on facial recognition technology, right? Brand new technology or evolving technology, going to have huge market potential, but also very, very scary from a privacy perspective. Rather than waiting for things to just grow out of hand and possibly bring in regulation to shut the whole thing down, or having CEOs dragged before Congress to answer very embarrassing questions, we said, listen, let's get the vendors who are going to be using the technology and privacy advocates who are very concerned about the technology, put them in a room and say, hey, what are the concerns? Can we adopt voluntary guidelines that the vendors can follow that make the privacy advocates happy so we can grow the economy and still protect privacy to some extent? Yesterday, we had our first meeting of this new process for UAS, or as the rest of the world calls them, drones. It's interesting, the cyber and drones are the two terms, even though we've tried to keep more productive language otherwise. Similar question, though, for drones, which is a lot of people want to use this technology to make money. A lot of very valid concerns in the policy community. Let's come together. So what are our goals for the security side? Well, to start with, the high-level goal is the stability and growth of the ecosystem. How do we make the internet more secure, right? We've all had that. So I joined the department, and we had a request for comment saying, hey, what should we work on? We're not going to be looking at every issue. We're not going to be changing laws. What are key issues that by bringing different parts of the ecosystem together, we can foster conversations that haven't happened yet? We got some very interesting ideas. We got some ideas that perhaps could have used a little bit more thought out, but we got from a very broad range of stakeholders. We heard from, industry associations. We heard from individual companies. We heard from startups. A few hackers wrote in and said, hey, here's what we think you should do. And we looked through the comments, and the idea that seemed to make the most sense, there was a lot of popular support for it, was that old chestnut, and old chestnuts are the tastiest chestnuts, of vulnerability disclosure, right? Is there anyone in this room that has not participated in an online flame war about vulnerability disclosure? Okay, we got a few people. That's excellent. This is good. So there'll be a little bit that's new here, but by and large, this is something that's been around for a while. And by the way, to clarify, we officially call it vulnerability research disclosure to make it clear that this is about the private sector, not about the government aspects. So let's talk about history, right? Not that kind of history. This kind of history. We heard this morning in the panel, so I'm not going to dive super into depth for it, but this is something that's been going on for a while. In my case, the first paper on the topic that I peer-reviewed was in 2006. There had already been a debate going on in the academic world about this question, and if academics have been writing papers about it, that means the real world had been dealing with it for another 10 years prior to that. So we know that it's messy. We know that there are no clear lines, and we also know that there are benefits of working together. Now, that's all well and good in theory, but we have to move past the world of theory. So why are we addressing this now? Well, there are a range of ongoing efforts right now. There is some excellent work. It's been done by Katie Messrs, who I think many people in the room know, developing an ISO standard, putting her blood, sweat, and tears into making something happen. At the moment, if you wanted to read that standard, you'd have to shell out $5,000 or $10,000. Hopefully that will change. So there's certainly some progress going along. There's also a lot more public attention around this particular issue. You know, I don't have to tell you all the fun news stories that you've heard about from the last few weeks devoted to the events here in Las Vegas of this week to know that this is now something that went from being a niche issue that people in the security community argued about, and maybe some lawyers got involved with, to being something that is now dominating the headlines. And unfortunately, when you have this much public attention about something, you have that much, you have this conversion of policy people into it, you tend to get not ideal policy. So it's the signing of the Patriot Act. We also have an evolving market for it. There are more and more bug bounty programs that are coming up. Lots of companies are experimenting, dipping their toe in the water. Josh Corman in the Calvary Room told the story that, in fact, some companies dip their toe in the water only to be punished for it. United sort of tentatively took a first step and was excoriated for not going further in, for not taking the giant plunge. So to help with that, there are now an increasing number of middlemen coming out. You've got HackerOne, you've got BugCrowd. People are saying, all right, we don't expect you to run this yourselves. We'll bring you the experience and keep those crazy people in the utility-kilts from you having to actually interact with them. We'll handle the interaction part. All right, well, that sounds easy. How do we think about vulnerability disclosure? Well, the first order of approximation is we have two sides. And I realize it's going to be a lot more complicated than that, but we can talk about, we have blue team, the vendors, we have the red team, the researchers. What are their motives? What are their capacities? Well, let's start with the researcher side. So, any Hogwarts fans here? We can divide researchers into 4 different groups, and you'll forgive me this. So first we have the people that care about doing it because the internet needs to be safer. These are the heroes who are just doing it because it's what they believe. Then, of course, we have Ravenclaw. These are the academics. Right? These are people who are doing it for the wisdom. They want to understand the systems, and if they find the vulnerabilities, well, they'll figure out what to do with them as they discover it. They care about the knowledge. Now, there's no shame in wanting, a little bit of money. There's no shame in that. I think there's a little bit of that in all of us. Slytherin is certainly the most practical of the 4 houses, and no one wants to be fucking Hufflepuff, so really there are only 3 houses. So that's the motives. They're very different. We acknowledge that. What about capacity? Well, as we remember from the movie Incredibles, everyone is special. Which means no one is, but of course we acknowledge that there are some people who are good at different things than others. So we have very different motives. We have very, very different capacities. Now on the vendor side, what can we say about what the vendors want? Well, those greedy bastards just want money, right? Any vendors in the room? You're all greedy bastards. No. They want the same thing that all of us want. They want stock images of cybersecurity, and they want good security. Well, to be more precise, vendors want security, but to be more important, they want to satisfy their customers. Right? They are, to be honest, running a for-profit business, but also we have to acknowledge that if we expect them to look after the security of their customers, security is one part of the overall well-being of their customers. They don't want to break their customer systems, and they don't want to remove the trust that the customers have given them. Vendors also have different types of capabilities, right? There are maturity models. Different firms have different abilities. There are some companies that have been doing this for a while. There are some companies that are just too small. They don't have the security people to know what to do with this. There are some companies that say, listen, we will dedicate many man-hours to figuring out how we deal with the vulnerabilities, but even that takes a while. We don't have that many people. So we have to acknowledge that different types of enterprises, different types of vendors, have very different capabilities as well. And of course, context matters. A cloud is different from a car. We have different technology, but we also have very different markets. We have very different regulations. We have many different factors that are at play. So by and large, on both sides of our multicolored scrum, we have great heterogeneity, great diversity. Now, diversity is great for finding different ideas. If we're trying to find common ground, we need to work a little hard. But on the other hand, we have a lot more ideas at play to find it. So what are the outcomes that we are trying to build here at the Department of Commerce? Well, we are looking for the silver bullet. You've heard there's no silver bullet. Of course, there's no silver bullet, right? There is no one-size-fits-all model. Everyone is going to be a little different. Moreover, we have no intention of forcing people to fit into something that's going to be a poor match. We understand that in the research community, people are looking for different things. We understand that vendors have many different interests at play as well. What are we trying to build? Well, we're trying to build a set of principles. We're trying to find a way of saying, all right, at very least, if we can't have best practices for everything, we can have some higher level best practices. We can have the Magna Carta of vulnerability disclosure. A set of principles that we can appeal to, that both sides buy into. So as we begin to develop policies at the enterprise level, policies at the sector level, policies at the industry level, we can point to them and say, actually, we're trying to follow this goal. So maybe we can tweak what you're saying a little more to adhere to this goal. What is the holy writ from which we can develop the law? How are we going to do that? Well, like I said, talking. That's the tool we have. It's completely voluntary. We're not going to drag anyone there. It's also open. We don't keep people out. Anyone can come. Now, this is scary for a lot of people, especially people who are used to working either in tight-knit collectives or industry consortia where you know the people that are around you. The 8 guys, and there are always guys in this situation, who are like in the room and they say, we're going to pound this out, and then everyone will just listen to us. That's not how this works. There will be, shall we say, difficult people in the room. Now, the good news about that is, unlike a closed process, a regulatory process, where the loudest person gets the most attention, if it's open, we can say, that guy's an asshole. I don't like working with assholes. And there are 2 things that happen, right? People stop working with this individual, or people take him aside and say, listen, we're trying to get something done. How can we find ways of working together? Because it really is about finding common ground. Now, how that happens comes from the community. I am not going to tell you, we are not going to tell you, this is the exact problem we are trying to solve. We all know that we need to do something in the space of vulnerability disclosure. But actually defining the problem has to come from the community. The community has to have ownership of it. They have to set the agenda. They have to advance it. The job we in commerce are going to have is to make sure, okay, you guys said you were going to have this part done by this week. How you doing? This is going to be a series of meetings. It will require work. Just as legislation requires lobbyists, we're going to require smart people, not the lobbyists, the smart people, to actually figure out how we can find common ground. That is going to be a little onerous. My background is an engineer and an economist. Talking shouldn't work, right? Kumbaya is not how we can think of getting things done. But this has to happen for a number of reasons. First, has anyone ever been in a long meeting, a couple-day meeting, trying to solve a problem, and on the 3rd day you realize that on the 1st day, what she said was bloody obvious, and you end up following it anyway? That's just how groups happen. But we have to bring people together. The first goal is to build trust. Having people in a common room helps people realize, oh, they're not just crazy people with weird hair. They actually mean it when they say they care about security. They're not just in it for the glory. Oh, I never thought about how long it would take to develop a patch. Yeah, it kind of makes sense that they would have to actually figure out how it wouldn't break all their customer systems. We all know this. It helps to be in the same room and acknowledge it. We need to build trust. We want to build predictability. One of the main outcomes has to be that both on the vendor side and the researcher side, they know what they're getting into, or at least they know what they think they're getting into. Again, this isn't going to solve everything. There are going to be plenty of people in the world on both sides who say, screw it, that's not the way I want to do it. But if we can make it so that most people, when they come together and say, I have found something in your system, you want to take a look at it, we can actually say, oh, this is what I could expect. And I can expect certain things from certain types of organizations. And an organization can communicate with me what I might expect. And I can communicate with the organization what they might expect. That's going to be a huge deal in making this work better. And perhaps the end goal is going to be in reducing friction. We want to make it so that this market works and this community works, because we're not just trying to solve the market and we're not just trying to build the community. We're trying to solve both of these issues, or at least address both these issues at the same time. But the more time we have to spend dealing with this bullshit and keep having the same debate in the long run, the less work we can actually do about securing products for customers, for consumers, for citizens around the globe. So, what's the big picture? Okay, so markets evolve. This is good. Sometimes markets evolve and it gets a little tricky. How can we smooth the way? We love it when markets work, but people sometimes need a little hand-holding as things evolve, as things change, as things mature. Certainly, the security community has evolved and matured, and we know the vendor community is evolving and maturing as well. So we need to make sure that this happens in a fairly smooth way. We want to have predictability. We also want this to be something that we can export. Right? How many countries do you guys know of around the world that are saying, oh my God, everything on the internet is broken? I know. We'll fix it with regulation. Or, even worse, I can say that everything on the internet is broken, and that gives me an excuse to regulate the internet for, economic, political, etc. reasons. And of course, there are some of the real concerns that we all face as part of our jobs, as part of our daily lives as researchers. How do we try to find some way of making sure that this isn't something that gets pushed illegally? I don't think it's a real exaggeration to say that if things continue in the current path, there could be some very real challenges. Congress doesn't handle nuance well, right? Try thinking about how to explain Rapid 7 in a congressional hearing and why it should be legal at all. Well, that's fine. Rob said this morning, we're all just going to go offshore. Great. Except, one, that's just not good for anyone. So, how do we get the people who make the decisions about legal to think? Well, like I said, I don't have a gun, I don't have a badge. The US government is an incredibly large and complex organization. You guys have worked in large organizations. You know that different parts are trying to optimize different things. That's the way it's supposed to work. The Department of Justice is trying to protect us the best they can with the tools and the mental models that they have. So one of my goals is to give Congress, the Department of Justice, and I'm sorry I don't have a picture of Loretta Lynch looking thoughtful, so we have our ex-Attorney General up here, something to look at and say, oh, this works. We can actually come up with an example of the research community and the vendor community collaborating, cooperating. Therefore, we don't need to regulate. Or, even better, as we change laws, we'll improve them. And if those of you who heard Jen Ellis talk this morning, she talked a lot about the need to improve, her perspective on how to improve DMCA and CFA and the others' laws. But it's not just law enforcement we need to worry about. There is a certain amount of peer pressure we're trying to involve. If more companies every day are starting to depend on the research community, they're going to look a little more askance when other companies in their space go running for their lawyers. We want to change norms here. This isn't something that changes easily. This isn't something we can say, if we all do this, then X will happen with great certainty. But we can say, that companies talk, that lawyers talk. And the more people that we have giving talks saying, hey, listen, rather than running for your lawyers at these big bar association conferences in very attractive exotic locales, saying, listen, you don't have to run for your lawyers. Here are examples of how this works. We want to bring them in the fold as well. So, final bullets. So I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions and conversation. We are launching a multi-stakeholder process on vulnerability disclosure. It's going to be open, anyone can participate. It's going to be transparent. Meetings will be webcast. There's nothing that's going to be hidden. And it's going to be based on consensus, not unanimity. We don't vote. Consensus just means enough people in the room say, yeah, I think we've got it. We've got it from here. We're not trying to create a new government agency. We're not trying to create a new ongoing program. The goal is really to have the community come together and find what it needs. In however capacity we can do that. And if we can only take a small bite at first, we'll take a small bite. And then we'll take a bigger bite. If we think that the best thing to do is to say, well, let's just look at web applications, because those are easy, or consumer-facing websites. And then we'll get to the difficult stuff. That's fine too. So I don't think the first immediate point should be leaping straight into industrial control systems. Right? You never want to start off something like this where one side can just say, people will die. Right? Don't want that. And similarly, there's also a lot of other regulation. So we're trying to find areas where, listen, this is unregulated, let's keep it unregulated. But we need your help. So, how can you help? Talk to us. There's my email address, my Twitter handle. Please, if you have something to say, let's find some time to chat this week. I'm leaving Saturday morning because apparently I hate future Alan. Tell your friends. Join us for our first meeting in September. It's going to be in the Bay Area. It'll probably be the second week in September, maybe the third, but probably the second week in September. Probably at Berkeley. We're still trying to find the exact location. I was trying to nail it down for this talk. We don't have the exact time. If you're interested, let me know. I'll make sure that you get notified when we have the meeting out. It's going to be webcast, and this isn't going to be a little passive webcast. We actually try to build this in such a way where people who are participating remotely can actively participate and engage. And ask good questions. If you think this is weird, if you think it's hokey, tell me. How can we make it better? So that's really what I have to say today. This is your government. We are trying to do our best. And if you have suggestions for how we can do it better, please let me know. And there's a mic here, or we can pass it.
So there is a group of people who are already working on the same problems, the same bullets that you have. Why are you trying to duplicate the efforts?
So there are many groups of people who are trying to work on this problem.
Group of people are working.
So I'm just going to angle this up a little bit. There you go.
The group that's working on vulnerability disclosure and coordination is called Vulnerability Coordination Special Interest Group. It's formed under Forum of Incident Response and Security Teams, but the group is open for anybody who's interested in participating in vulnerability coordination and disclosure.
Fantastic. And sorry, it's a special interest group. It's a IEEE SIG?
It's a Forum of Incident Response and Security Team SIG.
Okay, it's the first
SIG.
Okay.
Yeah, first, which is the same people who brought you CVSS and so on.
Fantastic.
The group kickstarted in June, so it's new.
Okay.
We have only had a few meetings so far. All the goals that you listed are the same as the group.
That's fantastic. I will endeavor to learn. I've talked to at least half a dozen people who are members of FIRST, founding members, and I will make sure that I can work with them closely. Thank you.
So would you like an easy question, a hard question, or an unsolicited testimonial?
Let's go in reverse order.
You never go wrong complimenting people first. So I've known Alan for quite a few years in quite a few settings. I'm really, really excited
You won't leave me alone.
that he's in this role and this opportunity is happening. It may succeed greatly, it may fail greatly, but it's really important, it's really valuable, and he's a great person to be in this role.
All right, now will you take your money?
Okay, now for the hard question. So in some of these past efforts, I'll point to the cybersecurity framework as one example, a high proportion of the participants, their job title was government relations coordinator liaison from big company XYZ. And a lot of the contributions were in the direction of, I'm here to push or nudge this effort this direction because it's in the interest of my sponsor. And my personal opinion is that sort of effort, that sort of talking, is not value added to getting things done. So how do you imagine organizing or recruiting or facilitating so that there's more effort toward getting things done and less toward what I'd call lobbying?
Sure. I think there are two responses to that. One is it makes sense when there's more than one voice from an enterprise or an organization coming, because for several reasons. One, there are many organizations that legitimately have multiple voices, right? Microsoft, Google, they have many different separate stakes in this. So it makes sense they don't participate as one body. Two, often, if I can get, and Josh Corman has talked about this as well, if I can create a room in which the lobbyist is in the same room as the deputy CISO, that's fantastic, right? What are the chances that those guys have sat down and talked before? In terms of the real question, which is, if someone's working in their self-interest, is that somehow against the general public interest? I think the goal behind the multi-stakeholder model is to say, if they come in good faith, then we don't want to work against a large groups of people's self-interest, because that's not how you create voluntary progress. So the goal is to have people come and say, yes, come in self-interest. Let's find how your self-interest overlaps with the self-interest of others. If we have a space, I don't believe that we can look at the space and find an instance where there's simply no common ground. There are enough people that want the same things. The challenge is how we've been talking about it has been framed poorly. So we need to talk about self-interest so that we can identify, oh, if you feel that way, well, maybe we can do this. Does that make you happy? Does that still satisfy your real goals? Because people will take particular positions that they think are in their self-interest, but in fact, the positions are only slightly tangential to their real interests. There are going to be organizations that say, you know what? I've been told this, this is great. We like what you're doing. We're not going to change what we're doing. We've thought about this a lot. We're not going to do it. And that's on all sides, right? So, Usenix Security Conference said, should we have a vulnerability disclosure policy? These are really smart people who've been doing security research for decades. And they said, no. We believe that if something is intellectually important enough to be accepted at Usenix, then we're not interested in the broader social ramifications. We're not going to have a declared policy. We have to respect that. That has to be built into our discussion. You had an easy question.
How is your process similar or different to past multi-stakeholder processes, including Cyber Leap Year, Cybersecurity Framework, and the National Trusted Identity something or other?
Sure. The first one I can punt on. I don't know enough about Cyber Leap Year. The Cyber Framework came directly from President Obama's Executive Order 13636, which said, hey, whoops, my first plan of having regulation didn't work. Thanks, Chamber of Commerce. That policy was going to give all the power to DHS. And they said, all right, well, if we can't do anything by mandate, we're going to get everyone in a room to do it voluntarily. What does that look like? Well, the first order say, let's just find out what all the existing tools that are available are and create a framework for organizations to assess risk and figure out how to climb that risk chain. Maturity model. So I really like the notion of a maturity model as a tool. That was the goal of that was to build a very specific document. While it was led by the community, a lot of the drafting was done by NIST, and it really was hearing from many different people as well as iterative. The goal here is really to focus on the iterative dynamic of conversation from a fixed community rather than to make sure we hear from, we want the participants there at the beginning. Another way of thinking about the differences is the framework looks at risk inside an organization, We are looking at my overall mission in the US government is to look at risks that span between different parts of the ecosystem, where no one actor is coming together. There are areas where people are already working. Great, we don't want to duplicate. NSTIC, the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, also out of the US Department of Commerce, is focused on a very particular engineering task. They have a standing body, they have a steering group, they have internal governance, they have they have a checkbook, they've been giving grants, and they're really trying to solve a very important problem, which is how do we create a whole new identity layer in the digital ecosystem? How do we foster it in such a way that still reflects the values of privacy and digital autonomy and things like that? And basically the way they've got companies to participate in that is, hey guys, if we don't work together, in 4 years we're all going to be doing our online banking with Facebook Connect API. So let's find a solution. No? Let's see. Digital identity is another talk.
Unless somebody bumps me off, I'm going to keep asking questions.
Are you including Mikey Dickerson and his group in this? Are you supposedly inviting them to participate?
I do not yet know Mikey Dickerson. Tell me about Mikey Dickerson.
Mikey Dickerson is the head of the U.S. U.S. Digital Service.
Okay, sure.
The people who came in and basically unfucked healthcare.org.
Right. No.
And then were set up to basically be an executive branch body to keep track of digital stuff. And so they're actively bringing a lot of people from industry, and so they have a rotating body of people who you should make sure his organization is at least aware of this effort, because he'll want to send people to.
That's a great idea, and thank you. And certainly, I personally know a lot of people at 18NF, which is where it's the digital services group is based. I will say that one of the reasons I have not done a lot of affirmative outreach on this particular issue is our focus and indeed our mandate is not inwardly facing in .gov. Now, part of that sounds like a cop-out, government heal thyself. The challenge is twofold. One, it's actually astoundingly hard for the government to heal itself. It's so much harder for the US government to make progress in IT projects than it is for any large organization. And two, there is a law called the Federal Advisory Commission Act, FACA, which legally prohibits me from asking for lots of people's opinions without going through a formal congressionally mandated process for internal government affairs. If you're advising government policy, you have to go through this process. This is why government is so awesome. Yes, I cannot devote this cannot be about government policy, but certainly we'll reach out to them.
Specifically, his broad ties to industry.
Great.
People who are responsible for operations and response.
Thank you. No, that's great. And certainly a lot of people have said, listen, you're focusing a lot on the product people, focus on the operations people, and that's been very helpful. Anyone else other than Russ? All right.
A provocative idea for you. Maybe, in addition to consensus, you might want to actually promote progress in divergent directions. And then maybe, in addition to talking, you might want to promote doing, as in pilot projects, tabletop projects, anything that gets something done to show how something might work, to inform people's opinions about what is or is not possible, or what the consequences might be, or how something might be done.
What's a pilot project in this space look like? And if anyone has an idea of what that, I don't have a clear vision. So if someone can share with that, please tell me.
I don't know enough details about this specific case, and if I spouted something off the top of my head, I'd just be stupid. But I think there's a number of ways to mock up or simulate administrative or economic or even regulatory processes in ways that you can attempt to assess how well they're going to work functionally, how they would work institutionally, and you could, I think, get some useful work done promoting people to go off and do something for 90 days and come back and report on a result, in addition to talking about things and offering, encouraging people to arrive at some consensus.
That's a great idea. By the way, for those of you who don't know, Russ's dissertation is on computational models of organizational and technical systems. So there's a certain, where did he pull that idea from? And certainly, you know, in terms, one of the things as I've been traveling this great land of ours, I've been talking to a lot of people about what the process would look like. Would there be working groups? Some people have said, actually, what we want you to do, Alan, is appoint chairs from the community that are trusted, because you, as the U.S. government, can't tell people to shut the hell up. They don't know me well enough. So we want you to appoint chairs the way, you know, an IETF working group does, to manage the process, and you just stay behind the scenes and write the big old government checks. There are lots of other options that we can explore when it comes to process. I like the idea of trying to have do-outs, and certainly one of the process that's a natural fit is at least go home and write something, and then come back and let's kick it around.
I'm done.
Thank you.
I've got a question.
Fantastic.
I think all of us in the room know that security people could yell about a problem till they're blue in the face, and until the public knows that there's a problem, nothing gets done.
Mm-hmm.
Because public pressure moves companies. That's how it works. So how do we get the public to listen to what the heck is being said on both sides of this table? Where do we pull the public into this conversation?
That is an excellent question. I don't have a clear answer to that. You know, my approach has always been, or at least not always been, has certainly been to say, high-profile incidents tend to inspire reactions that may not be thought through as well as they could be. The natural pathway from strong public concern to policy has been through congressional hearings or initiatives like the Department of Commerce trying to hire a failed academic. So, you know, we're going to say the latter is a decent step forward. The former, again, is quite tricky. If you have an example of where strong public concern has led to a strong nuanced response, I think that's great. And would love to chat with you more on that. But certainly that's something that I would like to think about a lot more. You know, it's almost like Section 7 in the paper instead of, you know, oh, we're going to have logging and auditing, right, which you have in every system and you never care about. Similarly, in a lot of security talks, it's, oh, well, we need the public and consumers to drive things. I don't think we can sit around and just wait for that.
No, yeah, but we need to get them on board so that everybody's moving in the same direction together, as opposed to the, oh my God, somebody drove a car off the side of the road.
Right.
Fix it now.
And sure. And I think one, you know, just off the top of my head, one thing that we can imagine is, you know, a discussion or at least some market research from the vendors, from different sites, from different types, saying, how much inconvenience are you willing to put up with while we try to secure your products for you? Can we have a website that's down for a little bit while we upgrade it? Most marketing people would say, absolutely not, you can't do it. Everything has to be done hot swap. Can we find some way to engage the public or at least build some patience for it so that we can sort of ramp up the cycle that it takes and you know, have the timeline question be resolved a little more satisfactorily? That could be something that, you know, the vendors can focus on, you could imagine. Certainly having the security research community consider public uptake of patches is another approach, right? Okay, that should be part of my internal calculus about how I'm going to engage with this vendor is how are those vendors' customers going to respond? And how can we as a security community increase that public awareness as well? So certainly, you know, talk to everyone you know and make sure their shit's up to date. Anything else? That was brief in my remarks. I'm happy to go on for a long time. Yes?
The danger with bringing in the public.
I'm just going to hand this to you. Thank you.
The dangers with bringing in the public is that anything that could influence their opinion is either something that they can monetize on, like some kind of a software liability. If you buy an internet wireless router and a vulnerability is found, they get 10% of the money back. or something like a Jeep driven into a ditch or whatever that is dangerous and gets the hype going, which would cause often a knee-jerk reaction from legislation, so that's also undesirable. I'm not sure you really want the public kind of pulling this, or...
I'm not saying they need to be pulling it. I said they need to be in the process. Because if we don't keep them aware of what's happening, when a solution is found or consensus is reached, how do you then get the public into the game? How many people have cars whose airbags will explode on them?
But
And they aren't bothering to get it fixed.
But the large majority will never care about security. They only care about usability.
And-
it's our responsibility to make it secure by design.
And I think one of the tools we have at our disposal is we have civil society to play the intermediary. And certainly, I've talked with both consumer groups as well as civil society groups to say, hey, what do you think about this? The EFF doesn't just care about hackers; they care about everyone on the internet. And I've talked with Kurt about this. He's skeptical but open to it. So I think that's one other area that we try to engage the public is through the proxies of civil society.
Yes, I think also part of it is as companies hopefully become more transparent and it's becoming a new normal, hopefully to disclose vulnerabilities, it will, I think, over time become a measure of, and you just disclose a vulnerability and within X amount of days it's patched, because that is something you can measure from the outside. I think over time that might, kind of a track record for a company of how secure they are or how they handle their security. So I'm not saying that this is something that the normal mainstream layman can look at and measure and kind of validate the company, but it's at least it's a step like it's something that other people or companies maybe can build on top of to make a smiley, whatever you want to put it on, like of the company's security awareness and security responsiveness. It's not something we built today because it's a very, very new thing for companies to disclose their vulnerabilities and how soon they patch them. But hopefully that is one of the things that can bring the public in.
Thank you. Did you have a response quickly?
I read an interesting blog recently from a German researcher. He's running a pretty big German research company. Incidentally, the same guy who's hosting the Troopers conference. And he has a large crew researching different devices, cars, medical devices, and so on, hypervisors, and they find a lot of vulnerabilities. And he says, in his experience over the last 5 years, companies have actually gotten worse in handling vulnerability disclosure, which is not a very reaffirming thing, if he's right.
Well, so yeah, feel free to jump in on that. But I think while you're saying that, I think there's a lot more complexities, and certainly as companies climb a maturity ladder, you would expect a certain U-shaped curve as they go from not being aware at all to being, saying, "Oh, wow, we've got to bring in all these people to make sure that what we're not doing is making things worse." So I was chatting. I had dinner last night with a vendor who said, listen, go back to the Heartbleed patches. So we had to release a patch, and then we had to release a patch for the patch. Then 6 months later, it happened again. That the first time we tried to fix something, that it didn't take. We had to update it. Now, if you're developing if you're developing a cloud product, that's okay, right? You can do it on the fly. If you're developing very large, big steel enterprise software, that gets a little trickier. And that gets this notion that it's a very heterogeneous idea. The high-level principles have to find a way to reflect that while still pushing the goal that we have to protect people.
So talking about the principles and back to you, you mentioned the security community should be the one driving the change. And you also mentioned that 5 years from now, disclosing vulnerabilities is getting worse and worse. And who's pushing the security community and who discloses vulnerability is the security community itself. So how would you interpret that? if we're going down and getting worse into disclosing vulnerabilities, we have more vulnerabilities to be disclosed. Transparency seemed to be a problem.
I actually said that this guy said that over the last 5 years we had gotten worse in his experience. So we had been getting worse for the last 5 years in this guy's experience. And I don't know if he's right. It was just an interesting read.
We are now degenerating into doing peer review of hearsay, which is always a tricky...
Anyway, we have another interesting example. The ODay from the last week, the right to file, the DULT, the Mac OS X ODay. There was, as far as I understand, no real way for that to be disclosed to Apple in a more responsible manner. They're not listening.
I think that's why this conversation has to be with both groups. It can't just be us telling the vendors, get your shit together, because they're not going to do it. And similarly, and because that's happened, we've had those groups. And similarly, the vendors have sat around and said, we need these guys to get their act in order. It has to be both groups coming together and figuring out what can we do to work together. And that is the kumbaya moment, and it's easy to dismiss it. But I think that's the tool we have at the moment. And the risks of not doing something are pretty high. So if there's a better way forward, we're all ears. And I think you get the last comments before we get
last
kicked
one
out.
before we wrap up, yeah?
I actually have some first-hand experience because we're one of the companies that also host bug bounty programs. And I think on our platform we have about 10,000 vulnerability reports come in over time from a couple of hundred companies. And we just recently started actually disclosing vulnerabilities, and we're just at shy of 50, I think. But a few months ago it was 0. So it's kind of saying like, it's just getting started, but I think it's slowly getting there. But we're also just discovering more vulnerabilities, I think.
And the final caveat is, of course, and I think Russ will like this as well, as with just about everything in security, data is going to make our lives much, much better. And I know that a number of the companies who are playing the role of middlemen have stepped in on that. There's a young grad student at Penn State that's been doing some work with HackerOne. I know Berkeley has written a very interesting paper on it. So there's some data that's coming out, and certainly we're reading it voraciously. If you have personal experiences, horror stories, words of caution, please get in touch. And we really are very interested in making sure that we can make this work. So thank you for your time.
It's not so